History has a way of hiding its most fascinating secrets in plain sight. Think about the last time you flipped through a history book, how many pages were devoted to the grand battles, the famous rulers, the well-worn tales of empires rising and falling. But what about the quiet, overlooked moments, the ones that didn't make the headlines of their time, yet somehow reshaped the world in ways we're still feeling today? Picture this: a single decision made in the shadows of an ancient marketplace, a whispered conversation between scholars in a forgotten library, or an invention so simple it barely earned a mention in its own era, yet these are the threads that quietly wove the fabric of our modern lives. That's exactly what we're uncovering in this journey through 30 forgotten events that shaped ancient history. These aren't just footnotes or curiosities, they're the hidden turning points that redirected the flow of civilizations, the small sparks that ignited revolutions in culture, technology, and power. Some of these events were so subtle that even the people living through them didn't realize their significance. Others were deliberately erased, buried by time, or by those who wanted to control the narrative. But here's the thing: these moments didn't just vanish, they left echoes, traces, and if you know where to look, you can still see their influence in the world around you, from the way cities are built to the languages we speak, even to the foods we eat. So why does this matter now? Because history isn't just a collection of dates and names, it's a living, breathing story, and we're all part of it. When we uncover these forgotten events, we're not just dusting off relics, we're piecing together the real, messy, human story of how we got here. And sometimes the most surprising connections leap across centuries. Imagine a law passed in ancient Mesopotamia that still influences modern legal systems, or a trade route established by accident that became the backbone of global commerce. These aren't just historical trivia, they're reminders that the past is never really gone. So let's pull back the curtain together and discover the events that history almost left behind, but shouldn't have. Long before Pompeii became the symbol of ancient destruction buried in ash, another volcanic catastrophe shook the Mediterranean with such force that its echoes still ripple through history. Around the year 1600 BCE, the island of Thera, now known as Santorini, exploded in one of the largest eruptions ever recorded. The blast was so powerful it sent shockwaves across civilizations, reshaping the course of trade, culture, and even mythology. The Minoans of Crete, a thriving seafaring society with intricate palaces and bustling ports, were just 70 miles south of Thera when the volcano unleashed its fury. Imagine the sky darkening without warning, the earth trembling, and then a tidal wave perhaps as tall as a 10-story building crashing into coastal cities. Archaeological digs at Akrotiri, a Minoan settlement on Thera frozen in time by volcanic ash, reveal eerily preserved homes with vibrant frescoes still on the walls. But unlike Pompeii, this wasn't a sudden burial. The Minoans had time to escape. The absence of human remains suggests they fled before the worst hit. Yet their civilization never fully recovered. Trade networks collapsed, palaces were abandoned, and the balance of power in the Mediterranean shifted forever. Here's where history blurs into legend. Centuries later, Plato would write of a wealthy island nation swallowed by the sea in a single day, a tale many believe was inspired by the whispers of Thera's destruction, passed down through generations. The parallels are striking: an advanced culture, a catastrophic natural disaster, and a disappearance so complete it became myth. But the eruption's real legacy wasn't just in stories. It cleared the way for new powers like the Mycenaeans to rise, redirected trade routes that would shape economies for centuries, and even influence climate patterns as far away as China, where records speak of strange weather in the years that followed. What's fascinating is how much we've pieced together from tiny clues. Tree rings show slowed growth around the world in that era, likely from volcanic dust blocking sunlight. Pumice from Thera has been found in Egyptian tombs, proving trade connections we'd otherwise have no record of. This wasn't just a local disaster, it was a global event hiding in plain sight, waiting for us to connect the dots. And perhaps that's the most profound lesson here. Sometimes the smallest fragments of the past hold the biggest stories. Just a few centuries after the volcanic fury of Thera reshaped the Mediterranean, another catastrophe struck, this time not from nature's wrath, but from a web of chaos so tangled that historians still debate its causes. Around 1200 BCE, the Bronze Age world, a thriving network of grand palaces, bustling trade routes, and sophisticated empires, crumbled like a sandcastle at high tide. The Hittites vanished, the Mycenaean palaces burned, Egypt barely held on, its pharaohs boasting of victories against mysterious invaders they called the Sea Peoples. But what exactly happened? Picture a domino effect of disasters. Climate records from tree rings and ice cores tell us of prolonged droughts, crops failed, famine spread, and desperate populations began to migrate. At the same time, trade routes that had fueled these civilizations for centuries snapped like overstretched threads. Copper and tin, the lifeblood of Bronze Age tools and weapons, became scarce. Armies weakened, and then came the raids. Ancient letters from Ugarit, a coastal city in modern-day Syria, plead for help as unidentified attackers burned cities to the ground. One chilling tablet reads, "The enemy ships are already here. Our cities are destroyed." Then, silence. The city was abandoned, its ruins left untouched for centuries. The Sea Peoples remain history's ultimate mystery. Were they a single group or many, refugees displaced by drought, opportunistic pirates, or something else entirely? Egyptian carvings show them in horned helmets, arriving in waves by land and sea. Ramesses III claimed to have defeated them, but the cost was staggering. Even Egypt, the superpower of the age, slid into decline afterward. Some scholars think these invaders weren't the cause of collapse, but a symptom, a desperate surge of people fleeing worse chaos elsewhere. Others point to earthquakes, internal rebellions, or even a breakdown in the complex systems that kept these kingdoms running. Here's what's haunting: this wasn't a slow fade. It was a lights-out moment. Writing systems disappeared overnight, the linear B script of the Mycenaeans, gone, leaving Greece in a dark age for centuries. The Hittite capital Hattusa was torched and never rebuilt. The survivors didn't just lose cities, they forgot how to build them. Megalithic structures from this era show a return to simpler, cruder techniques, as if knowledge itself had unraveled. Yet from this wreckage rose new worlds. The Phoenicians filled the trade vacuum, the Greeks eventually reinvented writing, and iron replaced bronze, changing warfare forever. What makes the Bronze Age collapse so gripping isn't just the scale of destruction, but the questions it leaves us. How do societies so advanced simply vanish? And how many of our own vulnerabilities, climate stress, resource shortages, political fragility, echo theirs? When archaeologists dig through the ashes of these cities, they're not just uncovering the past. They're holding up a mirror. Deep in the marshes of southern Spain, where the Guadalquivir River meets the Atlantic, lies one of history's most tantalizing riddles, a civilization so wealthy it inspired biblical legends, yet so thoroughly erased that even its name was nearly forgotten. This was Tartessos, a kingdom of towering cities and legendary kings, flush with silver and bronze from mines so abundant they seemed touched by the gods. Greek historians like Herodotus wrote of its splendor, describing a land where rivers ran with precious metals and sailors brought back tales of palaces gleaming in the sun. The Bible's Tarshish, famed for its ships carrying ivory and apes to King Solomon, might well have been Tartessos, or so many scholars believe, yet by the 5th century BCE, this beacon of Iberian culture vanished so completely that archaeologists are still piecing together its fate from whispers in the earth. What makes Tartessos extraordinary isn't just its wealth, but the precision of its disappearance. Unlike Pompeii or Atlantis, there's no layer of ash or mythic cataclysm to blame. Instead, the clues point to a slow unraveling. Excavations at sites like Cancho Rono reveal intricate gold jewelry, Phoenician-style pottery, and altars to unknown gods, proof of a culture that thrived on trade with seafaring empires. Tartessos sat at the crossroads of the Mediterranean and Atlantic, its people master metalworkers who turned local ores into coveted treasures, but then, the trade routes shifted. Phoenician colonies, once eager partners, began bypassing Tartessos for richer markets. A changing climate may have flooded its farmlands, while political unrest fractured its alliances. The most haunting theory: Tartessos didn't fall to invaders or disasters, it was abandoned. Imagine a people so tied to their identity as middlemen of the metal trade that when the world moved on, they simply dissolved. No burning cities, no last stands, just a gradual retreat into the hills, their language fading into local dialects, their gods absorbed by newer cults. Later Roman writers vaguely recalled Tartessians as a people of the past, but their cities were already myths. Even the river that once nourished them, the Tartessos, changed its name to the Guadalquivir, as if erasing them twice over. Yet Tartessos lingers in the margins. A single inscription, the Tartessian script, taunts researchers with its untranslated symbols. A handful of gold belts and silver bowls, looted from forgotten tombs, surface in museums with no context. And every few years, a new discovery, a sunken ship, a buried wall reignites the hope that we might yet hear Tartessos speak. Perhaps its greatest lesson is how fragile even the mightiest civilizations can be when the tides of trade, climate, and time turn against them. After all, if a kingdom of such wealth could vanish so quietly, what does that say about the empires we call eternal? History often paints Egypt as the eternal conqueror, the civilization that built towering pyramids and dominated its neighbors, but there was a moment when the tables turned completely. In the 8th century BCE, a powerful kingdom from the south did the unthinkable. It marched north, seized control of Egypt, and installed its own rulers as pharaohs. This was the Nubian 25th dynasty, led by rulers like Pi, whose name once echoed through the halls of Thebes and Memphis. Pi wasn't just another invader. He saw himself as Egypt's rightful heir, a devout follower of the god Ammon sent to restore order to a land fractured by petty warlords. When he rode his chariot into battle, his troops carried not only spears but a sense of divine mission. After crushing his rivals, Pi did something extraordinary. He returned to Nubia, leaving local governors in charge but demanding their loyalty. His successors, like Taharqa, would go further, rebuilding temples, reviving artistic traditions, and ruling Egypt with a blend of Nubian and Egyptian customs. For nearly a century, the so-called Black Pharaohs proved that power in the ancient world could flow south to north as easily as the Nile. But what fueled this ambitious kingdom? Look deeper and you'll find an industrial revolution hidden in the sands. The kingdom of Kush, Nubia's heartland, wasn't just rich in gold, it was an iron powerhouse. While Europe languished in its pre-Iron Age darkness, Kushite smelters were perfecting techniques to produce high-quality steel. The ruins of Meria, their later capital, still hold towering slag heaps, evidence of furnaces that burned day and night. Iron from Kush became the backbone of African trade, shipped across the continent to forge weapons, tools, and even the nails that held distant kingdoms together. This wasn't just about metal. Kush's iron industry shifted the balance of power. No longer reliant on imports, Nubian armies could equip soldiers with superior weapons, while farmers used iron plows to tame tougher soils. The wealth generated funded grand pyramids at sites like Nuri, smaller than Egypt's but just as ambitious, and when Assyria finally pushed the Nubians out of Egypt, Kush didn't collapse, it pivoted, focusing on trade routes that stretched to India and the Mediterranean. What's often overlooked is how this story flips modern assumptions about technology and power. We think of ancient Africa as a recipient of innovation, not its source. Yet Kush's iron mastery predated Europe's by centuries, proving that technological leaps weren't confined to the so-called cradles of civilization. The Nubian pharaohs and their iron, might remind us that history has no fixed centers, only currents of power, waiting for someone bold enough to redirect them. Jungle vines twist around stone faces the size of small houses, faces with broad noses, full lips, and helmets so detailed you can still see the stitching carved into rock. These are the Olmec colossal heads, 17-ton monuments scattered across ancient Mexico, staring silently through centuries as if guarding secrets we've only begun to guess. Carved between 1500 and 400 BCE, these heads weren't just art, they were declarations. But declarations of what? The Olmecs, often called Mesoamerica's mother culture, left no written records, so their giant sculptures speak for them. Each head is unique, likely portraits of powerful rulers, their features so strikingly individual that you'd recognize them in a crowd, but it's their possible connections that spark fierce debate. Some scholars point to the head's broad facial structures and suggest links to African seafarers who might have crossed the Atlantic long before Columbus. Others argue these features simply reflect the diversity of indigenous Americans, noting that nearby skeletal remains show similar traits. What's undeniable is that the Olmecs had access to technologies far ahead of their time. Without metal tools, they shaped basalt boulders hauled from mountains 60 miles away, possibly by raft along rivers, then polished them with abrasives until they gleamed. Beyond the mystery of their origins, the heads reveal a society obsessed with legacy. At La Venta, 4 heads face outward like sentinels around a ceremonial plaza, as if guarding the living from the supernatural. Their helmets hint at a culture where ball games weren't just sport but sacred rituals, with winners, or losers perhaps sacrificed to the gods. The Olmecs even seem to have invented the concept of centuries before the Maya, using it in their calendar systems to track time with eerie precision. Yet their greatest influence might be what they passed down. The Maya borrowed their gods, like the feathered serpent later known as Kukulkan. The Zapotecs adopted their writing system. Even the Aztecs, millennia later, collected Olmec artifacts as relics of a golden age. The heads, then, aren't just relics, they're the first chapter in a story that would unfold across pyramids and codices, a story that began with a people who dared to carve their rulers' faces into eternity, challenging us to remember their names. Imagine setting sail into the unknown with nothing but the stars to guide you, no maps, no GPS, just the restless curiosity that drives humans to explore beyond the horizon. That's exactly what the Phoenicians did around 800 BCE, launching ships from the shores of modern-day Lebanon and altering the course of history in ways we're still unraveling. These weren't just traders, they were the ancient world's most daring navigators, and their journey around Africa remains one of the most audacious feats of exploration long before the age of discovery. Commissioned by the Egyptian pharaoh Necho II, Phoenician sailors embarked on a 3-year voyage that defied every convention of their time. Picture this, hugging the coast of Africa in wooden ships barely larger than fishing boats. They sailed south past the Red Sea, battling currents and unknown terrors. Herodotus, who recorded the tale, scoffed at their claim that the sun appeared on their right side as they rounded the continent's southern tip, a detail modern scholars recognize as proof they actually made it, since this would only happen below the equator. When they finally returned to Egypt, their holds brimming with exotic goods and their minds full of uncharted coasts, they'd done more than complete a royal assignment. They'd proven that the world was far more connected than anyone dreamed, but the Phoenicians' legacy wasn't just in distance covered. Along the way, they planted colonies like Carthage, a modest trading post that would grow into an empire to rival Rome. These weren't just ports, they were cultural hubs where ideas, goods, and technologies mingled. The Phoenicians didn't conquer with swords but with commerce, weaving a network of trade that stretched from Britain's tin mines to the spices of India. Their greatest gift, though, was something far more enduring, an alphabet so simple and adaptable that it became the ancestor of nearly every writing system in the Western world. While Mesopotamia's cuneiform and Egypt's hieroglyphs required years to master, the Phoenicians stripped writing down to its essence, 22 consonants that could be learned in days. This wasn't just practical, it was revolutionary. Greek traders adopted it, adding vowels to create their own script. The Etruscans passed it to the Romans, whose letters still dominate global print today. Even Hebrew and Arabic scripts trace their roots to those bold sea merchants. The Phoenicians didn't just carry goods, they carried the very tools of thought, democratizing literacy in a way that shaped civilizations from Athens to Washington. Yet for all their influence, the Phoenicians remained shadowy figures. They left few grand monuments, no epic poems singing their praises. Their cities, like Byblos and Tyre, were dismantled stone by stone, their records scattered to the winds. But their legacy is etched into every book, every street sign, every text message we send. They remind us that sometimes the quietest revolutions, the ones inked on parchment rather than carved in stone, are the ones that truly change the world. High in the mountain passes of Central Asia, where the air thins and the wind howls through rocky gorges, caravans once moved like threads weaving together the fabric of the ancient world. At the heart of this bustling network stood the Sogdians, a people from the valleys of modern-day Uzbekistan and Tajikistan who became the undisputed masters of Silk Road commerce. While empires rose and fell around them, the Sogdians built something far more lasting, a web of trade, language, and faith that stretched from Constantinople to Chang'an, turning them into the invisible architects of cultural exchange for nearly 1,000 years. What made the Sogdians extraordinary wasn't just their geographical position, it was their genius for adaptation. They didn't conquer with armies, they conquered with contracts. Fluent in multiple languages, they served as translators, bankers, and diplomats for every major power along the Silk Road. Their letters, preserved in the ruins of a Chinese garrison at Dunhuang, reveal a world where a merchant in Samarkand could order goods from a partner in Loyang as easily as we send a text today. One particularly colorful complaint from a Sogdian trader laments a shipment of low-quality silver. "If you send such rubbish again, don't expect me to pay." These weren't just businessmen, they were pioneers of globalization, but their greatest legacy wasn't in silks or spices, it was in ideas. Sogdian caravans became mobile universities, carrying Buddhism from India to China and Manichaeism, a now vanished faith, deep into Central Asia. Their cities thrived as religious melting pots where Zoroastrian fire temples stood beside Buddhist stupas and Nestorian Christian churches. In Bukhara, a Sogdian center of learning, scholars debated philosophy in bustling bazaars, while their artists painted murals blending Persian elegance with Chinese brushwork. Even their script, derived from Aramaic, became the blueprint for the Mongolian and Manchu alphabets centuries later, yet history has a way of swallowing even the most influential cultures. As the Tang dynasty in China and the Abbasid Caliphate in the Middle East grew stronger, they bypassed Sogdian middlemen, cutting into their profits. Then came the Arab conquests of the 8th century, which replaced Sogdian Zoroastrianism with Islam and eroded their linguistic dominance. By the time Genghis Khan's armies stormed through in the 13th century, the Sogdian language had faded into obscurity, their cities reduced to way stations for newer powers. The irony is palpable. A people who once connected continents were left fragmented, their contributions buried under the sands of time, until archaeologists began deciphering their letters and uncovering their art. Today, walking through the restored frescoes of Afrasiab, where Sogdian nobles once feasted beneath paintings of Chinese emperors and Turkish horsemen, you can almost hear the echoes of a world where borders were fluid and cultures bled into one another. The Sogdians remind us that the most enduring empires aren't always the ones built on swords, but on the quiet, relentless exchange of goods, words, and dreams. Rising from the highlands of Ethiopia like stone giants frozen mid-reach, the obelisks of Axum stand as silent witnesses to a kingdom that once commanded the crossroads of continents. These towering stelae, some reaching over 100 feet tall, weren't just monuments, they were the billboards of an African superpower that rivaled Rome, Persia, and even distant China in wealth and influence. Carved from single slabs of granite with intricately detailed false doors and metal adornments glinting in the sun, these structures marked the tombs of kings who ruled a realm stretching from the Nile to the Arabian Peninsula. But how did a kingdom nestled in the Ethiopian highlands become such a pivotal player in the ancient world? The answer lies in a simple but revolutionary commodity: ivory. Axum sat at the choke point of trade routes linking the Mediterranean with India and beyond. Its merchants traded African elephants' tusks for Roman gold, Indian spices, and even Chinese silk, a fact confirmed by Axumite coins found as far away as southern India. The kingdom's Ge'ez script, one of the earliest writing systems in Africa, appears on stone tablets boasting of conquests from Yemen to Sudan. One inscription by King Azana reads like an ancient press release, declaring victory over the Kushites in a campaign that reshaped the balance of power in Northeast Africa. Yet Axum's true power wasn't just military, it was cultural. When Rome still worshipped Jupiter, Axum became one of the first kingdoms to officially adopt Christianity in the 4th century, building churches like the legendary Mariam Chin, said to house the Ark of the Covenant. The obelisks themselves are feats of engineering that still baffle archaeologists. Without cranes or pulleys, Axumite engineers transported 300-ton stones from quarries miles away, then erected them with precision that would challenge modern builders. The largest, now fallen and shattered, may have been the tallest single stone monument ever attempted in the ancient world, surpassing even Rome's Lateran obelisk. But these weren't just vanity projects, each carving false windows, symbolic doorways, even bronze plaques depicting royal regalia, served as a conduit between earth and heaven, aligning with Axumite beliefs about divine kingship. What's often overlooked is how Axum's decline holds eerie parallels to other forgotten empires. As Islam spread in the 7th century, Red Sea trade routes shifted away from Axum's ports. Deforestation from intensive farming and shipbuilding eroded the kingdom's agricultural base. By the time Portuguese explorers arrived in the 15th century, the obelisks were already ancient mysteries, their builders' language preserved only in church liturgies. Yet Axum's legacy lingers in ways we're still uncovering. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, direct heir to Axum's faith, still uses Ge'ez in its rituals. And those massive stelae, they inspired 20th century architects who designed monuments from New York to Berlin, proving that even the quietest civilizations can cast the longest shadows. For centuries, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon have been celebrated as one of the ancient world's 7 wonders, a lush, terraced paradise built by King Nebuchadnezzar for his homesick queen. But what if this iconic marvel wasn't in Babylon at all? Recent archaeological discoveries suggest the gardens may have actually flourished 300 miles north in Nineveh, the heart of the Assyrian Empire. The confusion began with ancient Greek historians like Strabo, who never saw the gardens firsthand and likely conflated 2 great Mesopotamian cities. But crumbling clay tablets and intricate irrigation systems unearthed in Nineveh tell a different story. Assyrian King Sennacherib, not Nebuchadnezzar, left behind detailed inscriptions boasting of an unrivaled palace, with a sprawling garden watered by an advanced network of aqueducts and screw pumps technology centuries ahead of its time. One text even describes bronze Archimedean screws lifting water from the Tigris River to cascade down terraces planted with exotic trees. Archaeologists at Nineveh found remnants of this very system, stone channels lining the palace walls, matching Sennacherib's proud records. Meanwhile, Babylon's ruins show no trace of such gardens. The implications are staggering. One of history's most famous landmarks might have been mislabeled for millennia, its true origins buried under the weight of mistaken identity. But Assyria's greatest gift to history wasn't just botanical beauty, it was the written word. In the 7th century BCE, King Ashurbanipal amassed the ancient world's most comprehensive library in Nineveh, a treasure trove of over 30,000 clay tablets. Unlike other conquerors who burned books, Ashurbanipal sent scribes across his empire to copy every text they could find, from medical manuals to epic poetry. His library became a time capsule of Mesopotamian knowledge, preserving works like the Epic of Gilgamesh, which might otherwise have been lost forever. What makes this collection extraordinary isn't just its scale but its purpose. Ashurbanipal, unique among rulers of his era, was literate, a scholar king who personally curated his library. Tablets were meticulously organized by subject, some even labeled with instructions like, "Let no one take this away." The library held everything from omens decoded from sheep livers to mathematical theorems, recipes for glue, and even early versions of fables like The Fox and the Crow. When the Babylonians sacked Nineveh in 612 BCE, they unknowingly did history a favor by baking the clay tablets in the fires that destroyed the city, hardening them for archaeologists to rediscover 2,000 years later. Together, the gardens and the library reveal an Assyrian empire far more nuanced than its reputation for brutality suggests. Here was a civilization that engineered ecological marvels, while safeguarding humanity's collective memory, proof that even the fiercest conquerors understood the enduring power of beauty and knowledge. The real wonder isn't just where the Hanging Gardens stood, but how Assyria's dual legacy of innovation and preservation continues to shape our understanding of the ancient world. The story of Japan often begins with samurai and shoguns, but centuries before those icons emerged, a quiet migration from the Korean peninsula rewrote the archipelago's destiny. Around 300 BCE, a wave of newcomers later called the Yayoi crossed the narrow straits separating Korea from Kyushu, bringing with them two innovations that would reshape every aspect of life: rice paddies and bronze swords. Before their arrival, Japan's Jomon people had thrived for millennia as hunter-gatherers, crafting intricate pottery and living in harmony with forests and tides. Within a few generations, the Yaoi's technologies turned these islands into a society of villages, granaries, and chiefs, laying the foundation for what would become the world's most enduring imperial dynasty. Rice was the game changer. Unlike the Jomon's foraged meals, Yayoi agriculture produced surplus food, allowing populations to explode. Archaeologists find traces of their paddies, grids of irrigated fields so efficient they're still studied by modern farmers. But grain alone didn't fuel this transformation. The Yayoi also brought metallurgy, casting bronze bells used in rituals and iron tools that cleared dense forests. Their weapons tell a darker story. Skeletal remains from this era show slash marks consistent with a new kind of warfare, suggesting rival clans battled over fertile land. The cultural fusion that followed was anything but peaceful. DNA studies reveal modern Japanese people inherit roughly 10 to 20% of their ancestry from the Jomon, with the rest tracing back to Yayoi migrants and later waves from the mainland. Yet the Jomon didn't vanish, they adapted. Their spiritual reverence for nature blended with Yayoi rice gods, creating early Shinto practices that persist today. Even their pottery styles merged, with Yayoi vessels adopting Jomon-like rope patterns in a silent homage to the past. What's often overlooked is how quickly this shift occurred. In just 500 years, Japan's population may have quadrupled, its people organized into chiefdoms that traded with Han Dynasty China. By the 1st century CE, a Chinese chronicle described Wa, their name for Japan, as a land of 100 warring states paying tribute to a queen named Himiko. This was the Yaoi's ultimate legacy, a blueprint for centralized power that would eventually unite under the Yamato emperors. The most striking evidence of their influence isn't in artifacts, but in language. Linguists agree Japanese grammar is distinct from Korean, yet nearly 60% of basic vocabulary words for rice, metal, even numbers share roots with ancient Korean dialects. It's as if the Yayoi didn't just bring crops and tools, they planted the seeds of a hybrid identity that would one day flower into samurai, tea ceremonies, and Tokyo's neon skyline. Their migration proves that sometimes the most profound revolutions begin not with conquest, but with a single grain of rice taking root in foreign soil. Perched along Peru's arid northern coast, the Mach people built a civilization that thrived for centuries until the skies opened in a deluge unlike anything they'd ever seen. A catastrophic El Niño event unleashed torrential rains that turned their desert home into a watery nightmare. Rivers burst their banks, mud brick temples melted like sugar, and farmlands drowned under layers of silt. This wasn't just bad weather, it was a climate disaster that cracked the foundation of a society already teetering on the edge. The Mach were masters of hydraulic engineering, carving canals through bone-dry valleys to feed fields of corn, beans, and squash. Their cities gleamed with adobe palaces adorned with murals of fanged deities and erotic scenes pottery, so explicit it shocked early archaeologists, but their rituals reveal a darker side. At sites like Huaca de la Luna, skeletons of sacrificed warriors, their throats slit and bones stained with cinnabar, suggest a culture pleading with gods to control the uncontrollable. When the rains came, those gods fell silent. Excavations at Mach sites tell a story of desperation. In the final layers before abandonment, hastily built walls zigzag across plazas, as if trying to hold back the floodwaters. Storage rooms lie empty, their contents likely distributed in a last-ditch effort to stave off famine. Then the mud, layers of sediment, some several feet thick, preserve the moment everything stopped. But here's the twist: the Mach didn't vanish. Some communities migrated inland, adapting to new climates. Others reorganized into smaller groups, their art style evolving into what would later be recognized as the Lambiek culture. What makes their collapse so haunting is how modern it feels. The Mach didn't lack ingenuity, they'd survived smaller El Niño events before, but the scale of this disaster overwhelmed their systems. Sound familiar? Like us, they faced a climate crisis they'd helped engineer, their intensive farming possibly exacerbating erosion that made the floods worse. Their story isn't just about collapse, it's about resilience in the face of forces beyond human control, a reminder that even the most advanced societies must adapt or perish. Carved into rose-red cliffs where rainfall was scarcer than gold, the city of Petra shouldn't have thrived, yet it became the heartbeat of the Nabatean Empire, a trading hub so wealthy its caravans made kings envious. The secret wasn't just in the spices and silks that passed through its gates, but in something far more precious: water. In a land where droughts could last years, the Nabateans engineered a hydraulic marvel, so advanced it turned a desert canyon into an urban oasis. Their system of dams, cisterns, and ceramic pipes didn't just defy nature, it rewrote the rules of survival in arid lands. Walk through Petra's narrow sick today, and you'll spot channels carved into the sandstone walls, their slopes calculated to a precise gradient. These weren't mere decorations, they were arteries of a vast water network that caught every drop of rain before it could vanish into thirsty earth. The Nabateans built over 200 cisterns, some capable of holding millions of gallons, filtering sediment through layers of pebbles to keep supplies fresh. Their piece de resistance, a massive dam at the city's entrance, diverting flash floods away from the sick and into storage basins, a feat of engineering that modern hydrologists still study. But water was more than a utility, it was power. By controlling the desert's most precious resource, the Nabateans held a monopoly on trade routes linking China, India, and the Mediterranean. Camel caravans laden with frankincense and myrrh had no choice but to stop in Petra, where merchants paid taxes in silver and spies gathered intelligence under the guise of hospitality. The city's wealth dripped from its very walls. Even the famous treasury, carved to glow amber in sunlight, was likely a ceremonial space where tribute flowed as freely as water. Then came Rome. By the 1st century CE, the empire's hunger for control led it to bypass Petra entirely, redirecting trade to new sea routes through Egypt. The Nabateans, masters of land travel, found their caravans obsolete almost overnight. Worse still, the Romans appropriated their water technology without the nuanced understanding behind it. Aqueducts replaced the delicate balance of cisterns and catchments, leading to erosion and silt buildup that choked Petra's lifelines. Within a few generations, the city that once made the desert bloom was swallowed by sand, its secrets buried until a Swiss explorer stumbled upon its ruins in 1812. The tragedy of Petra isn't just in its decline, but in how thoroughly its innovations were forgotten. The Nabateans understood something modern cities are only now relearning. Sustainability isn't about forcing nature to obey, but bending like a reed to its rhythms. Their legacy whispers to us from every rainwater harvesting system in the Middle East, every drought-resistant farm, proof that even in the harshest landscapes, ingenuity can carve out a kingdom. And perhaps that's the most haunting lesson of all: civilizations don't always fall to war or famine. Sometimes they simply stop listening to the wisdom in their own walls. When Alexander the Great's empire fractured after his death, few would have guessed that one of its most enduring legacies would take root in the windswept valleys of Afghanistan. Yet here in the rugged heart of Central Asia, a line of Greek kings clung to power for centuries, blending the philosophies of Athens with the spirituality of India to create an artistic revolution that still echoes in Buddhist art today. These were the Bactrian Greeks, descendants of Alexander's generals who carved out a kingdom so isolated by mountains and deserts that they minted coins proclaiming themselves saviors of the East, while the rest of the Hellenistic world crumbled. What set these Greco-Bactrian rulers apart wasn't just their resilience, it was their willingness to reinvent Greek traditions in an alien land. Their capital, Ai-Khanoum, boasted Corinthian columns and Greek-style theaters, yet its temples held statues of local river gods alongside Zeus. By the time King Menander I embraced Buddhism in the 2nd century BCE, this cultural alchemy reached its peak. Suddenly, statues of the Buddha bore the serene faces of Apollo, his robes draping in Hellenistic folds so lifelike they seemed to ripple in the wind. This was the birth of the Gandhara style, where Greek realism met Buddhist symbolism in a fusion that would redefine art from Japan to Java. The Gandhara workshops produced masterpieces that traveled farther than their creators ever did. A Buddha sculpted in modern-day Pakistan might wear a toga like Himation, his curls arranged like those of a Greek athlete, while scenes from his life played out in reliefs that could have adorned a Roman sarcophagus. Even the concept of depicting the Buddha in human form, once taboo in early Buddhist art, may have been inspired by Greek insistence on giving gods mortal faces. The Bactrians didn't just adapt, they became conduits, transmitting techniques like chiaroscuro shading and anatomical precision to cultures that had never seen Mediterranean art. Yet their kingdom was always living on borrowed time. Caught between the nomadic Kushans and the expanding Han dynasty, the last Greco-Bactrian kings vanished from history by the 1st century CE, their cities swallowed by the Silk Road's shifting sands. But their art refused to die. Centuries later, Chinese pilgrims visiting Gandhara marveled at statues that looked as if alive, while Tibetan Thangkas borrowed the Greeks' layered drapery. Today, when you see the Dalai Lama's tranquil smile in photographs, you're glimpsing the ghostly persistence of a style born when a Greek king in Afghanistan dared to ask, "What if the Buddha could be beautiful like a god and human like us?" Beneath the blistering sands of the Sahara, where modern maps show only emptiness, the Garamantes carved out an empire fed by water older than the pyramids. These weren't just desert nomads, they were hydraulic geniuses who turned the world's harshest wilderness into a network of thriving oases. Using a system of underground tunnels called fagaras, they tapped into fossil water reserves laid down millennia earlier, channeling it to fields of wheat, dates, and grapes. Some fagaras stretched over 4 miles, their gradients calculated so precisely that water flowed effortlessly without pumps or wheels. The Garamantes didn't just survive in the desert, they mastered it, building cities like Garama, where Roman historians noted bustling markets trading gold, salt, and slaves across the dunes. What makes their story extraordinary isn't just their defiance of nature, but their reach. Garamantian pottery and glass have been found as far north as the Mediterranean, proof of trade networks that connected sub-Saharan Africa to the classical world. Their chariots, depicted in rock art racing across the desert, weren't war machines but desert taxis, lightweight vehicles designed for speed, carrying goods where camels couldn't yet tread. Yet by the 5th century CE, their wells began to run dry. The very technology that sustained them, those ingenious fagaras, had drained aquifers faster than they could replenish. The lesson written in their ruins is eerily modern. No civilization, no matter how ingenious, is exempt from the limits of its environment. Meanwhile, 1,000 miles south in what's now Nigeria, the Nok people were reshaping art and industry in ways that still reverberate. Their terracotta sculptures, unearthed from the jungle floor, are Africa's oldest known figurative art, human faces with swirling hairstyles, expressive lips, and almond eyes so lifelike they seem to watch you across the centuries. But these weren't mere decorations. The Nok were pioneering metallurgists, smelting iron as early as 500 BCE, centuries before most of Europe. Their furnaces, shaped like giant beehives, could reach temperatures high enough to purify ore into workable metal, producing tools that cleared forests and weapons that secured power. The mystery lies in why such a sophisticated culture vanished around 200 CE. Some theories point to overexploitation of charcoal, leading to deforestation. Others suggest a shift in trade routes left their ironworks obsolete, but their legacy is undeniable. Nok terracottas influenced later West African masterpieces like the Benin bronzes, while their iron techniques spread along the Niger River, fueling empires from Ghana to Mali. Together, the Garamantes and the Nok shatter old stereotypes of Africa's past, revealing a continent where innovation flourished in the unlikeliest places, whether beneath the desert's glare or the jungle's shadow. Their stories remind us that history's most brilliant chapters often go untold, not because they didn't matter, but because we forgot to look. They appear in ancient texts as faceless destroyers, a nameless horde that burned cities to the ground and left civilizations in ruins, the Sea Peoples. Egyptian carvings depict them in horned helmets, their ships prowling the Mediterranean like wolves. But who were these mysterious raiders really? For centuries, historians treated them as a single catastrophic force, but modern discoveries suggest a far messier, more fascinating truth. Start with the pottery. Along the coasts of Israel, archaeologists unearthed sherds with designs unlike anything made locally, bold geometric patterns, spirals echoing styles from Sardinia and the Aegean. These weren't trade goods, they were the dishes of settlers, left behind in layers of ash marking the violent end of cities like Ashkelon. Then came the DNA. Skeletal remains from Philistine graves, long thought to be local Canaanites, carried genetic signatures linking them to southern Europe. Suddenly, the Sea Peoples weren't just invaders, they were migrants, possibly displaced by the same droughts and famines that toppled the Hittites and Mycenaeans. Yet the puzzle only deepens. Some scholars argue the Sea Peoples label masks a chaotic mix of groups: Sicilian mercenaries hired by collapsing empires, Anatolian refugees fleeing famine, even Aegean pirates capitalizing on the chaos. A shipwreck off Uluburun in Turkey, stocked with goods from 7 different cultures, hints at a Mediterranean world where identity was as fluid as the tides. Even the Egyptians who first recorded their raids may have exaggerated their unity. Pharaohs loved a singular enemy to glorify their victories. Here's where history meets myth. The Bible's Philistines, arch-nemeses of the Israelites, might have been one faction of these seafaring groups. Their names, Peliset in Egyptian texts, match perfectly. But other records mention the Shurden, warriors with distinctive horned helmets who later served as pharaohs' bodyguards. Were they Sardinians? A relief in Medinet Habu shows captured Shurden wearing armor identical to bronze figurines found on their namesake island. The most compelling theory isn't about origins, but consequences. The Sea Peoples didn't just destroy, they reshaped. In their wake, new alphabets replaced cuneiform, iron replaced bronze, and decentralized trading networks replaced palace economies. Their greatest legacy might be the chaos that forced humanity to innovate, proof that sometimes collapse isn't an ending, but a brutal kind of rebirth. Buried beneath the shifting sands of China's Taklamakan Desert lie faces that defy every expectation: blonde hair, high cheekbones, and European features preserved for over 3,000 years. These are the Tarim mummies, a collection of bodies so startlingly out of place that their discovery in the 1990s upended decades of assumptions about who shaped the early Silk Road. Wrapped in finely woven woolens and buried in boat-shaped coffins, the mummies carry genetic markers linking them not to East Asia, but to the steppes of Ukraine and the forests of Scandinavia. How did these travelers from the far west end up in one of the most inhospitable deserts on Earth, and what does their presence tell us about the ancient world's hidden connections? The mummies' clothing alone tells a story of astonishing distances. Some wear tartan patterns identical to those found in Celtic Europe, while others sport felt hats resembling those worn by Scythian nomads. One particularly striking figure, the so-called Beauty of Lulan, rests with her auburn hair still braided, her leather boots stitched with precision that would rival a modern cobbler. Carbon dating places her burial around 1800 BCE, centuries before historians believed such cross-continental contact was possible. Even more puzzling are the funeral offerings: wheat, millet, and cheese, suggesting these weren't just passing traders but settlers who adapted their diets to the local environment. Genetic testing reveals an even more complex picture. While some mummies show pure ancient North Eurasian ancestry, others are genetic cocktails, mixes of European, Siberian, and even early Iranian farmer DNA. This wasn't a single migration but multiple waves of movement, with groups intermarrying along the way. Their languages remain a mystery, though traces of Tucharian, an extinct Indo-European tongue, were later found in the region's texts. The implications are profound. Long before Marco Polo or Zhang Qian, a web of unofficial trade routes crisscrossed Eurasia, carrying people, goods, and ideas in ways official histories never recorded. The real shock isn't just their presence, it's their influence. Artifacts buried with the mummies include domesticated horses and advanced chariot parts, hinting that these outsiders may have introduced critical technologies to China's Bronze Age cultures. Even the famous silk fragments found in their tombs, once thought to prove early Chinese trade dominance, now raise questions. Could silk have been moving west before the so-called Silk Road existed? The mummies' very existence forces us to reconsider who was driving these exchanges, and whether the narrative of East meeting West is far older and far more tangled than we ever imagined. Yet by the time of the Han Dynasty, these European-descended communities had vanished, assimilated or displaced by incoming Turkic and Mongol groups. The Taklamakan, whose name translates to "you go in and never come out," kept their secrets until the 20th century, when shifting dunes exposed their graves to the desert sun. Today the mummies stand as silent witnesses to a time when borders were fluid, identities were forged through movement, and the world was far more interconnected than our textbooks dared to suggest. Their ghostly faces challenge not just the story of the Silk Road, but the very idea that ancient civilizations ever truly lived in isolation. Before Rome ruled Italy, another civilization held sway over the land, one whose language still whispers to us from weathered stone and bronze, daring us to unravel its secrets. The Etruscans weren't just neighbors to the early Romans, they were their teachers, passing down rituals, architecture, and even the alphabet that would later script Rome's laws. Yet of all the gifts they left behind, their language remains the most tantalizing puzzle. Over 10,000 Etruscan inscriptions survive, from ceremonial texts etched on gold tablets to bawdy graffiti, scratched into pottery, and while we can read the letters borrowed from Greek and adapted, the words themselves stubbornly resist full translation. What makes this enigma so captivating isn't just the untranslated words, but the eerie familiarity of the fragments we do understand. Funeral tablets list family ties with terms like clan son and sect daughter, hauntingly close to Latin's filius and filia. A woman's tomb in Tarquinia bears the boast, "My Spurana, I was noble," yet other inscriptions, like the 6-foot-long linen scroll wrapped around a mummy, the infamous Liber Lintius, defy decoding despite being the longest Etruscan text ever found. The challenge, unlike Egyptian hieroglyphs or Mesopotamian cuneiform, there's no Rosetta Stone for Etruscan, no bilingual key to crack its code. Their origins deepen the mystery. Ancient historians like Herodotus claimed the Etruscans sailed from Lydia in Anatolia, fleeing famine. Modern DNA adds fuel to the fire. Genetic studies of cattle in Tuscany match breeds from Turkey, while Etruscan art echoes Anatolian motifs. Think elongated figures with almond eyes, similar to those in Hittite reliefs. Yet another twist comes from linguistics. Etruscan shares odd phrases with a single other known language, Rhetic, spoken in the Alps. Were they distant kin, or did their paths cross in some forgotten migration? The Romans, who absorbed so much from the Etruscans, seemed almost eager to erase their voice. By the time of Emperor Claudius, who wrote a 20-volume Etruscan history, now lost, the language was already fading, relegated to priestly rituals like reading omens and lightning strikes. Today, scholars use AI and comparative linguistics to chase shadows, matching Etruscan words to Basque or Hungarian in desperate gambles, but perhaps the most poignant clue lies in what the Romans didn't borrow. Their word for people was populace. The Etruscans used rasna. One empire's rise became another's silent epilogue, written in letters we can see but still cannot fully hear. Long before Portuguese caravels rounded the Cape of Good Hope, a fleet of 60 ships set sail from Carthage, their prows cutting through Atlantic swells no Mediterranean sailor had dared explore. This wasn't a military expedition or a trade mission. It was one of history's most ambitious voyages of discovery, led by a man named Hanno in the 5th century BCE. His journey along Africa's western coast would take him further south than any European for nearly 2,000 years, reaching lands of fire-breathing mountains and creatures his crew could only describe as hairy forest people. The account of Hanno's voyage survives on a single weathered parchment, copied and recopied by Greek scribes centuries after the original Carthaginian records were lost. It reads like something between a naval log and a traveler's tall tale. After founding colonies in modern-day Morocco, Hanno's fleet pushed south past the Sahara's dunes, where they encountered crocodile-infested rivers and heard the nighttime drumming of distant villages. But the real marvel came near the island they called Sirte, likely modern-day Senegal, when the horizon began to glow. By night, flames licked the sky from a mountain locals called the Chariot of the Gods. Today, geographers recognize this as Mount Cameroon, an active volcano whose eruptions would have terrified sailors used to the calm Mediterranean. Hanno's description of hairy people who threw stones and couldn't be captured because they climbed trees too swiftly is almost certainly the first written record of gorillas. His interpreters called them gorillae, a name that centuries later would inspire the scientific term, but here's what's fascinating: Carthage suppressed these discoveries. Unlike later European explorers broadcasting their finds, Carthaginian rulers guarded geographical knowledge like state secrets. Their maritime dominance relied on controlling trade routes, and letting rivals know Africa could be circumnavigated would have been commercial suicide. The proof of how far Hanno really went lies in the details only someone who'd been there could know. He describes anchoring in a bay filled with the scent of flowers, likely the mangrove swamps of Gabon, whose blossoms perfume the air at high tide. His mention of a river teeming with hippopotami matches the Senegal River where hippos still bask today. Even his account of burning rocks fits Cameroon's volcanic shoreline, where lava meets ocean in clouds of steam. What's heartbreaking is how close this came to being forgotten entirely. When Rome destroyed Carthage in 146 BCE, they burned its libraries, including whatever detailed maps Hanno's voyage produced. The single surviving summary only endured because a Greek scholar copied it for his own collection, yet this fragile thread of memory rewrites our understanding of ancient exploration. Hanno didn't just sail farther than anyone imagined possible, he proved that curiosity and courage could unlock the world's secrets long before the age of empires and compasses. His story whispers a tantalizing question: how many other voyages like this vanished into history's silence? For over 1,000 years, Egyptian pharaohs wrote of a land so wealthy, its very name became synonymous with wonder. Punt. The walls of Queen Hatshepsut's temple at Deir el-Bahri glow with vibrant paintings of this fabled kingdom, towering piles of incense resin, live baboons tied to leashes, and dark-skinned chiefs presenting gifts to Egyptian envoys. Yet despite countless expeditions sent to Punt, its exact location remains one of history's most stubborn mysteries. Was it nestled in the coastal forests of Eritrea, as some scholars argue, or did it lie across the Red Sea in Yemen's fragrant highlands? The answer matters more than you might think, because Punt wasn't just a trading partner, it was the ancient world's gateway to treasures that shaped empires. The goods the Egyptians coveted tell their own story. Myrrh, that golden resin dripping from wounded trees, was worth its weight in gold used in temple rituals, mummification, even cosmetics. Then there was ebony, black as midnight and harder than stone, perfect for royal furniture, but most intriguing are the animals, baboons and giraffes, depicted straining against ropes on temple walls. These weren't just exotic pets, they were living status symbols. Recent DNA tests on mummified baboons in Egypt trace their origins to modern-day Eritrea and Somalia, giving the first concrete clue in centuries. Yet Yemen can't be ruled out. Ancient South Arabian texts speak of a land called PWN, trading similar luxuries. The real irony: we know more about what Punt sold than who its people were. Egyptian artists depicted Punt's huts on stilts, their roofs shaped like domes, but left no written records of the kingdom's language or rulers. A single carved figurine found in Somalia, a man with distinctively Puntite features, hints at cultural connections, but it's a whisper in the dark. Even Hatshepsut's famed expedition, which brought back 31 live frankincense trees, focused more on the bounty than the place. Those trees, carefully transplanted in temple courtyards, died in Egypt's climate, a poetic metaphor for how Punt's essence always eluded grasp. Perhaps the most tantalizing clue lies in something the Egyptians barely noticed. Among the cargo lists from Punt is a throwaway mention of antiu, a substance once translated as myrrh, but now suspected to be something far more provocative: coffee. Yemen would later become the epicenter of early coffee cultivation, while Eritrea's highlands grow wild coffee varieties dating back millennia. If Punt was the original source, it means this kingdom didn't just trade goods, it introduced the world to an addiction that would fuel revolutions, spark conversations, and shape modern culture. The mystery of Punt endures because it represents something bigger than geography. It's about how civilizations remember and forget. The Egyptians wrote volumes about Punt's products but almost nothing about its people, reducing a vibrant culture to a shopping list. Today, as archaeologists sift through coastal caves in Eritrea and study petroglyphs in Yemen's mountains, they're not just hunting for a lost kingdom. They're trying to hear a voice that history nearly silenced, one that might yet rewrite our understanding of Africa's role in the ancient world. Until then, Punt remains where it's always been, just beyond the horizon, teasing us with glimpses of its riches. Somewhere between myth and migration lies one of history's most fiercely debated journeys, the arrival of the Vedic Aryans into the Indian subcontinent. For over a century, scholars have clashed over whether this was a peaceful fusion or a violent conquest, whether Sanskrit was an indigenous language or an imported one, and whether the roots of Hinduism sprang from native soil or distant steppes. At the heart of this controversy lies the Rig Veda, Hinduism's oldest sacred text, where hymns to gods like Indra and Agni might just hold clues to an ancient collision of worlds. The traditional narrative, shaped by 19th-century European linguists, goes like this. Around 1500 BC, light-skinned warriors on chariots swept down from the Eurasian steppes, bringing with them the earliest forms of Sanskrit and a patriarchal, fire-worshipping religion that would evolve into Hinduism. They called themselves Aryans, a term simply meaning noble in Sanskrit, later distorted by modern ideologies. Archaeological traces of their movement include horse-drawn chariots buried in the Urals and sudden shifts in pottery styles across northern India. Linguistic evidence is even more striking. Sanskrit shares uncanny similarities with ancient Greek, Latin, and even Old English, all branches of the Indo-European language family. But here's where the debate ignites. Indian nationalists and some revisionist scholars argue the Aryans were always native to India, pointing to the sophisticated Indus Valley civilization that flourished centuries earlier. They note the Rigveda's descriptions of mighty rivers like the Saraswati, which dried up around 1900 BCE, long before the supposed migration. Genetic studies add fresh fuel to the fire, while some DNA analyses of ancient skeletons show steppe ancestry appearing in India around the right time frame. Others reveal deep continuities in the subcontinent's population, stretching back thousands of years. It's as if science has handed both sides a knife, and they're using it to carve very different stories from the same bone. The political stakes couldn't be higher. Colonial-era historians weaponize the Aryan migration theory to justify European dominance, framing it as a superior race civilizing the East. Today, Hindu nationalists reject the idea entirely, fearing it undermines claims that Hinduism sprang solely from Indian soil. Meanwhile, Dalit activists sometimes embrace the theory, seeing it as proof that upper caste Hinduism was imposed from outside. Archaeology, genetics, and linguistics have become battlegrounds where identity politics and academic rigor collide. Yet beyond the noise lies a quieter truth. Cultures rarely spread through conquest or migration alone. The Vedic world that emerged was a tapestry woven from threads, both foreign and local. Indra's thunderbolts mingling with indigenous fertility goddesses, Sanskrit hymns adapting to Dravidian rhythms. Perhaps the real story isn't about who came first, but how the collision of ideas birthed something entirely new. The Rigveda itself hints at this fusion, praising a god who is both stranger and kin. In that paradox, we might find the only resolution this debate will ever need. On the sun-drenched island of Crete, where the ruins of Knossos whisper secrets of Europe's first advanced civilization, the artwork tells a startling story, one where women stood not on the periphery, but at the very center of power. Unlike the male-dominated pantheons of Greece or Egypt, Minoan frescoes and figurines depict priestesses commanding rituals, goddesses receiving offerings atop mountain peaks, and female figures gripping snakes with an authority that would make later patriarchs shudder. These aren't mere decorations. They're fragments of a society that might have rewritten everything we assume about ancient gender roles before it was violently silenced. Take the famous snake goddess statues, unearthed from palace shrines. Towering and elegant, these women grip writhing serpents in both hands, their bare breasts framed by elaborate tiered skirts. To modern eyes, they might seem like exotic fertility symbols, but their context reveals something radical. They were found in sacred spaces where religious power was practiced, not as consorts to male gods, but as supreme deities themselves. Even in everyday scenes, women dominate. Frescoes show them presiding over bull-leaping ceremonies, their elaborate hairstyles and flounced skirts marking them as elite participants, not spectators. One particularly striking mural from Akrotiri depicts a woman in a saffron gown accepting a necklace from a griffin, a creature later associated with divine royalty in Greek myth. The message is unmistakable. Here, women weren't just equal, they were revered. The roots of this female-centric culture might lie in Crete's isolation. Shielded by the sea, the Minoans developed uniquely without the warrior cults that shaped mainland societies. Their art lacks the battle scenes glorified by later Greeks. Instead, it bubbles with nature dolphins, lilies, and dancing figures celebrating life rather than conquest. Even their architecture hints at a different social order. Unlike the fortified palaces of Mycenae, Knossos had no defensive walls. Its labyrinthine layout, with light wells and communal courtyards, suggests a society built around collaboration rather than coercion. Then came the Mycenaeans. Around 1450 BC, fire ravaged Knossos, and with it, the symbols of Minoan femininity. Mycenaean warriors, with their rigid hierarchies and thunder god Zeus, overwrote the old ways. Suddenly, frescoes featured men in chariots, while snake goddesses were replaced by clay figurines of armed male deities. The shift wasn't just artistic, it was ideological. Linear B tablets from this period list women as slaves of the god, a far cry from their former priestly status. What makes this erasure so chilling is how thoroughly it succeeded. Later Greek myths transformed the Minoans' potent goddesses into monsters or pawns. Think of Ariadne, reduced to a love-struck girl helping Theseus navigate her own people's labyrinth. Even the word matriarchy became a punchline, dismissed by classical authors as primitive fantasy, yet the fragments persist in Demeter's enduring cult, in whispers of Amazons, in the fact that Crete's last Minoan-speaking women were still serving as oracles centuries after Knossos fell. Their legacy lingers in every crack of patriarchal certainty, asking us to reconsider who gets to write history and who gets erased. Deep in China's Yellow River Valley, where history and legend blur like ink in water, the Xia dynasty stands as one of archaeology's most heated controversies. For centuries, Chinese texts spoke of this semi-mythical First Dynasty, a glorious era marked by Yu, the great taming floods with a network of canals, and bronze vessels forged for sacred rituals. Yet until recently, no physical evidence could prove it existed outside folktales. The debate isn't just academic, it strikes at the heart of China's national identity. If the Xia were real, they'd represent the birth of 5,000 years of unbroken civilization. If not, the story of China's origins must be rewritten. The clincher came from an unlikely source, broken pottery. At Erlitou, a sprawling excavation site in Henan province, archaeologists uncovered bronze workshops, palatial foundations, and ritual vessels matching descriptions from ancient texts. Radiocarbon dating placed these ruins squarely between 21st and 16th century BCE, precisely when the Xia were said to reign, but here's where scholars clash. Traditionalists point to Erlitou's bronze casting techniques as proof of dynastic sophistication, while skeptics argue these could belong to any early Bronze Age culture. The real bombshell, oracle bones from the later Shang dynasty, never mention the Xia. Were they erased by rivals, or were they always just a story? Meanwhile, 1,000 miles southwest in Sichuan's mist-shrouded jungles, another mystery was erupting, one that made the Xia debate look tame. In 1986, farmers digging a well near Sangsingdui struck gold, or rather bronze. Beneath the mud lay a treasure trove so bizarre it seemed ripped from a sci-fi novel. Massive masks with protruding eyes and dragon-shaped ears, a towering tree of life crawling with snakes and birds, a statue of a man with bulging pupils, his hands gripping something unseen. None of this resembled the elegant ritual vessels of Shang or Zhou dynasties. This art was wild, alien. The craftsmanship was undeniable. These weren't primitive doodles but masterpieces requiring advanced metallurgy. Yet their symbolism was utterly disconnected from mainstream Chinese traditions. No inscriptions explained them, no historical texts even hinted at their existence. Some scholars link the masks to the ancient Shu kingdom, mentioned fleetingly in Zhou dynasty chronicles as a land of sorcerers. Others see influences from Southeast Asia or even Mesopotamia. Those bulging eyes might represent the same owl-faced demons worshipped in ancient Babylon. The wildest theory, that Sangsing-Dui represents a completely unknown civilization, one that flourished independently of the Yellow River's dynasties before vanishing without a trace. What binds these two enigmas together is what they reveal about China's past. The Xia controversy shows how even cherished national narratives can hang by an archaeological thread. Sangsing-Dui shatters the myth of a single, unified cultural cradle, proving multiple advanced societies sprouted across this vast land, each with its own gods and artistic language. One represents history straining to be verified, the other, history that refuses to be categorized. Together, they remind us that the ancient world was never as simple as our textbooks suggest, and that beneath every certainty, there's always another layer waiting to be unearthed. Beneath the Mediterranean sun, on an island barely twice the size of Manhattan, lies a cluster of stone temples so ancient they predate Egypt's pyramids by 1,000 years. The temples of Hagar Kim on Malta aren't just old, they're enigmatic. Walls curve into crescent shapes, altars drip with carved spirals evoking life's endless cycles, and statues of corpulent figures, some headless, others with exaggerated hips and thighs, stare blankly from shadowed niches. These weren't just places of worship, they were the epicenter of a fertility cult so pervasive that its echoes might still resonate in modern rituals. Yet around 2500 BCE, the people who built these marvels vanished, leaving behind no written records, no tales of war or famine, only stones that whisper questions we're still straining to hear. The architecture alone defies logic. Without metal tools or wheels, Neolithic Maltese quarried limestone slabs weighing up to 20 tons, then fitted them together so precisely that not even a knife blade can slip between the joins. But it's the temple's alignment that truly astonishes. During the summer solstice, sunlight pierces Hagar Kim's main doorway like a laser, striking a specific altar where statues of the so-called fat ladies, voluptuous goddess figures, once stood. Similar light shows occur in other Maltese temples, marking equinoxes and even the movement of the star cluster Pleiades. This wasn't primitive astronomy, it was a sacred calendar, tying agricultural cycles to celestial events with eerie precision. The fertility cult's physical evidence is equally compelling. Excavations unearthed altars stained with animal sacrifice residue, and hidden chambers filled with thousands of miniature figurines, most depicting women in childbirth or nursing infants. One chilling discovery, a stone slab with cup-shaped depressions, likely used to collect menstrual blood in rituals. These weren't just symbolic gestures, they were acts of desperation. Soil samples reveal Malta suffered brutal droughts during the temple builders' final centuries. When rains failed, the people likely doubled down on fertility rites, pleading with their goddess to restore the land's vitality. Then silence. Around 2500 BCE, temple construction stopped mid-cycle. No ashes from invasion, no mass graves from plague, just abandonment. The latest theory points to ecological collapse. Pollen records show forests cleared for farmland, leading to soil erosion so severe that crops withered. Starvation would have come slowly, leaving time for one last act of devotion, sealing temple doorways with rubble, as if protecting the sacred space from a world they knew they'd no longer inhabit. The haunting coda to this story, modern Maltese farmers still leave offerings at these ruins during droughts, a folk memory stretching back 5,000 years. The goddess may be gone, but the human longing for her blessing endures, etched not just in stone but in the stubborn persistence of hope. In the scorching deserts of China's Tarim Basin, where the ruins of ancient cities crumble under the relentless sun, a group of mummies with fiery red hair and European features once walked the earth speaking a language no one had heard in centuries. These were the Tocharians, a forgotten branch of the Indo-European family who carved out a thriving civilization along the Silk Road's northern routes. While most associate Buddhism with East Asia, it was these red-haired traders who preserved some of its earliest scriptures in a tongue so obscure that scholars didn't even recognize it until the early 20th century. The story begins with a cache of manuscripts found in the caves of Dunhuang, their pages brittle with age. At first glance they seemed like standard Buddhist texts, but the script was unmistakably Indian. Then came the shock. The language wasn't Sanskrit or Chinese, but something entirely unknown. Linguists dubbed it Tocharian, after the Greco-Roman name for the region, and soon realized it was a cousin to Celtic, Germanic, and Latin, stranded thousands of miles from its linguistic siblings. How did an Indo-European language end up in the heart of Asia, and why was it being used to copy sacred Buddhist verses? The answer lies in the Tocharians' unique role as cultural middlemen. Their cities like Kucha and Turfan were oasis hubs where Indian monks, Persian merchants, and Chinese envoys crossed paths. The Tocharians didn't just trade goods, they traded ideas. Their monasteries became libraries, translating Buddhist sutras from Sanskrit into Tocharian and from Tocharian into Chinese, bridging worlds with every brushstroke. One particularly stunning manuscript, the Tocharian Book of Medicine, blends Greek humoral theory with Ayurvedic remedies, proving how deeply these nomads absorbed and remixed knowledge. Their physical presence only deepens the mystery. The same Tarim mummies that baffled archaeologists, those tall, red-haired figures in tartan wool, were likely their ancestors. Genetic tests confirm they carried markers linking them to the Yamnaya steppe herders, who swept across Eurasia 4,000 years earlier, yet by the time the Tocharians appear in Chinese chronicles, they've fully adapted to the desert, wearing felt hats against the sun and burying their dead in boat-shaped coffins, as if expecting a watery afterlife in one of the driest places on Earth. What makes their disappearance so poignant is how thoroughly they were erased. When the Uyghur Khaganate conquered the region in the 8th century, Tocharian faded like a mirage. Today only fragments survive: a shopping list scratched on wood, a love poem lamenting lost youth, a merchant's contract for 3,000 bolts of silk. But their legacy lingers in the most unexpected places. The very word Buddha in Chinese, Fo, may have come via Tocharian, a linguistic fossil of their pivotal role. And those eerie mummies, their DNA lives on in modern Uyghurs, a silent testament to how thoroughly history weaves and unravels itself in the deserts of time. In the shadowy dawn of Japan's recorded history, where myth and history blur like ink on wet parchment, one figure stands apart, not as a conqueror or warrior, but as a shaman queen who wielded divine authority over life and death. Chinese chronicles from the 3rd century CE speak of a land called Yamatai, ruled by a mysterious woman named Himiko, who bewitched the people with sorcery and communed with spirits to maintain her power. To the emissaries of the Wei dynasty, she was both puzzle and paradox, a celibate sovereign who kept 1,000 female attendants, yet governed through a brother who served as her mouthpiece to the outside world. Was she a political genius cloaking her rule in mysticism, or a spiritual leader whose influence paved the way for Japan's imperial line? The answer may lie buried in the very soil of the Yamato Plain. The Chinese records compiled in the Weizhai offer tantalizing glimpses. Himiko's realm was said to be racked by constant warfare until the people elevated her to quell the chaos, a narrative echoing later Japanese myths of sun goddess Amaterasu withdrawing to a cave until lured back by ritual. The parallels are striking. Both women wielded spiritual authority to restore order, and both became central to claims of divine legitimacy. When Himiko died, the chronicles claim, a massive tomb was built, and 100 attendants were sacrificed to serve her in death. Then a king briefly took power only for violence to erupt again until a teenage girl relative, Io, restored stability. This cyclical dance of sacred femininity and political upheaval would replay centuries later in the Yamato clan's rise, suggesting Himiko's legacy wasn't just remembered, it was institutionalized. Archaeology adds another layer to the puzzle. In the Nara Basin, where Yamatai is theorized to have stood, excavations reveal keyhole-shaped burial mounds, often identical to those later used by Yamato emperors. The largest, the Hashihaka coffin, stretches over 280 meters and aligns with celestial events, much like Himiko's alleged divination practices. Inside, mirrors inscribed with Y dynasty dates have been found, matching gifts the Chinese texts say were sent to the Queen of Wa. Could this be Himiko's tomb? The Japanese government has notoriously blocked further excavation, fueling speculation that confirming her link to Yamato might append official narratives about the imperial family's unbroken lineage. The most provocative theory connects Himiko to the legendary shaman Queen Pimiko mentioned in the Kojiki, Japan's oldest chronicle. Here, the plot thickens. The Kojiki was compiled under Yamato patronage, centuries after Himiko's reign. If Yamato scribes deliberately absorbed her into their origin story, it would explain why later emperors adopted shamanistic rituals, like the Daijusai, where a new ruler communes with Amaterasu as cornerstone ceremonies. Even the title Himiko, which some linguists interpret as sun-child, resonates with the sun goddess mythology Yamato sovereigns later claimed as their birthright. Yet the greatest mystery isn't who Himiko was, but why she vanished from mainstream history. Chinese records mention her, then fall silent. Japanese texts compiled under male-dominated courts omit her entirely or repurpose her as a footnote. Only in the 20th century did scholars resurrect her story, sparking debates that rage today. Nationalists dismiss her as a Chinese exaggeration, while feminists hail her as proof of pre-patriarchal rule. Meanwhile, in the quiet villages near Hashihaka, locals still leave offerings at the mound's edge, as if sensing what academics dare not confirm, that Japan's imperial grandeur may owe its beginnings not to a warrior's sword, but to a queen's sacred mirror, reflecting power we're only beginning to understand. Long before the pyramids scraped the skies of Egypt, a culture in Eastern Europe was building settlements so vast they dwarfed anything else on the continent, only to set them ablaze in acts of deliberate destruction. The Cucuteni Tripilia people, stretching across modern-day Ukraine, Moldova, and Romania, constructed proto-cities around 4000 BCE that could house up to 20,000 inhabitants, a staggering number for the Neolithic world. These weren't just clusters of huts, they were meticulously planned communities with two-story houses, organized streets, and communal ovens large enough to feed hundreds. But the most bewildering detail, every 60 to 80 years, the inhabitants would burn their entire settlement to the ground layer after layer of ash, revealing a cycle of construction and conflagration that spanned centuries. What drove this ritualized rebirth? The evidence hides in the way they burned their homes. Archaeologists find no signs of warfare, no shattered skulls or arrowheads embedded in walls. Instead, the fires were controlled, even reverent. Houses were emptied of valuables before ignition, their ceramic goddess figurines and intricate pottery carefully removed. Some researchers believe this was a spiritual cleansing, a way to purify the land before rebuilding, echoes of which linger in later Slavic traditions of burning effigies to mark the end of winter. Others suggest practical motives. The settlement's wattle and daub structures, riddled with pests after decades of use, may have needed renewal, but the scale of the fires hints at something more profound. These weren't random acts, they were synchronized events, with entire neighborhoods set alight simultaneously under what must have been a collective decision. The artifacts left behind paint a picture of a society that balanced brutality with beauty. Their pottery, decorated with swirling spirals and serpent motifs, ranks among the most sophisticated of the Neolithic world, some vessels so thin-walled they're translucent when held to light. Yet these same people crafted amulets from boar tusks and kept skulls of aurochs mounted above doorways, suggesting a deep connection to both the artistic and the primal. Their goddess figurines with exaggerated hips and blank, staring eyes might represent deities of fertility or perhaps ancestors watching over the living. Most haunting of all is what happened when the practice stopped. Around 3000 BCE, the mega-settlements ceased burning. Instead, the culture fragmented into smaller villages, then vanished entirely. Climate shifts, overpopulation, or exhaustion from their cyclical rebuilding may have played a role, but their legacy lingers in the ashes layers of intentional fire that challenge our assumptions about permanence and progress. In a world obsessed with building to last, the Kushite Tripilia people embrace the radical idea that sometimes, to move forward, you must first reduce everything to embers. Among the ashes of Kushite Tripilia's burned settlements, one motif emerges again and again: spirals, not crude scribbles but precise, hypnotic coils etched into pottery, painted onto walls, even pressed into clay amulets. These weren't mere decorations, they were a visual language, pulsing with meaning. Some scholars see them as symbols of cosmic cycles, the turning of seasons, the endless loop of life and death that mirrored their ritual burnings. Others trace their curves to serpent imagery, linking them to later European myths of rebirth, but the most striking possibility, these spirals might represent the very layout of their mega-settlements, which archaeologists now realize were arranged in concentric circles radiating outward like frozen whirlpools. A people so attuned to patterns that they mirrored the universe in both their art and their streets. Then there are the figurines, smooth, genderless forms with elongated necks and featureless faces, cradled from the embers of burned homes. Unlike the voluptuous Venus statues of other Neolithic cultures, these figures refuse easy categorization. Some have faint suggestions of breasts or hips, but most dissolve into abstraction, as if the artist deliberately blurred the lines between male and female. Could this be evidence of a society that hadn't yet rigidly divided roles by gender? The artifacts hint at yes. Spindle whorls for weaving, traditionally women's work in later cultures, appear in houses alongside flint tools and hunting trophies. There are no grand tombs for warrior chiefs, no hordes of weapons buried with elite men, just communal graves where bodies were laid to rest with identical pottery and ornaments. The real clincher lies in their house layouts. Unlike later Bronze Age homes, where private spaces segregated by gender emerged, Kushite Tripilia dwellings were open and fluid. Central hearths served as shared spaces for cooking, crafting, and likely decision-making. Even their ovens tell a story: massive structures big enough to feed entire neighborhoods, suggesting food preparation was a collective act, not confined to individual households. This wasn't just equality in theory, it was baked into their daily rhythms, yet the most provocative clue might be what's missing. Among thousands of figurines, not a single one depicts violence, no weapons, no scenes of battle or domination. Even their animal motifs focus on fertility and abundance rather than predatory power. In a Neolithic world where other cultures were erecting monoliths to warrior gods, the Kushite Tripilia people seem to have worshipped something far more subtle: balance. Their legacy whispers through time in unexpected ways. The spiral motifs resurface centuries later in Celtic knots and Greek meander patterns. The gender-fluid figurines find eerie echoes in later Balkan folk traditions of androgynous spirits who mediate between worlds. And perhaps most tellingly, their cyclical burning rituals mirror modern ecological practices like controlled wildfires, the understanding that sometimes renewal requires letting go. In the end, their greatest symbol wasn't any artifact, but the way they lived, a fleeting, blazing proof that human societies can flourish without hierarchies, if only for a few bright centuries before the ashes settle. The sprawling ruins of Cucuteni Tripilia mega-settlements might lie buried beneath modern farmland, but their revolutionary approach to urban design pulsed through Europe's cultural bloodstream for millennia. Picture this: concentric rings of homes radiating outward like tree rings, communal spaces placed at strategic intervals, and a layout so intuitive it feels eerily modern. These weren't haphazard clusters of dwellings, they were blueprints for living that would resurface in places no textbook ever connected. Take the ancient Greek city of Larissa, where neighborhoods fanned out in arcing segments around a central agora. Or the circular strongholds of Celtic Oppida, their defensive walls mirroring the same radial logic. Even the medieval burghs of Germany and Poland, with their spiraling market roads, owe an unconscious debt to those Neolithic planners who understood that harmony could be etched into the very dirt beneath their feet. Yet their most profound influence might be invisible. The Cucuteni Tripilia emphasis on communal ovens and shared storage pits evolved into the public granaries and bakeries of Roman cities, a societal safety net repackaged as imperial innovation. Their practice of reserving central spaces for collective decision-making foreshadowed the Norse thingsteads and Slavic veches, where free men gathered under open skies to debate laws. Even the egalitarian distribution of household artifacts, no palaces, no hovels, found echoes in early Slavic settlements like Biskupin, where uniform longhouses suggested a culture allergic to hierarchy. It's as if Europe carried a genetic memory of these proto-cities, replicating their patterns whenever societies sought stability. So why did history forget them? Part of the answer lies in the biases of early archaeologists, who were obsessed with tracing Europe's roots to the noble Greeks and Romans, not primitive dirt farmers. The Cucuteni Tripilia left no written records, no conquering heroes to idolize, just ash and pottery, but the deeper reason is more unsettling: their very success made them invisible. Their innovations were so thoroughly absorbed by later cultures that they became the default, like oxygen in the air we breathe. We don't credit Neolithic minds for the concept of city planning any more than we credit fish for inventing swimming. The final irony: the very act that preserved their legacy, cyclical burning, also erased it. Each intentional fire purified the site for rebirth, but left little for later generations to marvel at. No crumbling colosseums, no half-buried temples, just layers of carbonized wheat and the ghosts of spiral motifs. Yet in that absence lies their enduring lesson: sometimes the most transformative ideas aren't those carved in stone, but those whispered through the quiet patterning of everyday life, waiting millennia for us to hear them. From the volcanic ashes of Thera to the water-starved ruins of Petra, from the iron forges of Kush to the spiral-marked pottery of Cucuteni Tripilia, these forgotten events didn't just happen to history, they rewrote it. Trade routes weren't just paths for silk and spices, they were neural networks transmitting ideas, technologies, and even languages across continents. The Sea Peoples didn't merely topple empires, they cleared the stage for new actors, forcing humanity to innovate or perish. And those colossal Olmec heads, they weren't just art, they were declarations of a cultural DNA that would later pulse through Maya city-states and Aztec temples. What binds these stories together is their quiet radicalism. The Nubian pharaohs proved that power could flow upstream against the Nile's current. The Sogdians turned caravans into mobile universities, where Zoroastrian hymns mingled with Buddhist sutras. Even the Garamantes, pumping fossil water in the Sahara, demonstrated that the margins could become the center until the margins fought back. These weren't footnotes, they were turning points where the ancient world pivoted in directions we're still untangling today. Yet textbooks often flatten this chaos into tidy timelines, as if history moved in straight lines from Mesopotamia to Rome to the West. The truth is messier and far more interesting. The Minoans' goddess worship might have seeded Greek myths, the Tacharians' translations bridged Buddha and Beijing, and the Yaoi's rice paddies birthed a nation that would one day build bullet trains. These aren't isolated curiosities, they's the hidden wiring behind everything from modern trade laws to religious rituals. So here's the challenge: next time you hear ancient history, don't just picture pyramids and legions, think of the Phoenician sailors squinting at the Southern Cross, the Aksumite merchant weighing Roman gold against Indian pepper, the Cucuteni Tripilia artist carving spirals as their city burned. History isn't made only by the loudest voices, but by the whispers too, the ones that shaped our world without bothering to sign their work. Now it's your turn. Which of these forgotten events reshaped your understanding of the past, or did we miss a hidden pivot that deserves its own spotlight? Drop your favorites in the comments, because the best thing about uncovering lost history is realizing how much still waits to be found.